So, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker this evening. And it's very interesting. I've received this thoughtful package, this biography, for introducing our guest speaker, Professor Upe Flueckiger. And without a doubt, it contains a very carefully distilled list of his accomplishments, including references to his work with Mario Botta in Switzerland, of course, and David Rockwell in New York City, Upe's time spent at Virginia Tech, where he received his Master's of Architecture degree, his collaborative architecture design with his wife, Carol, as well as references to two remarkable books, Donald Judd, Architecture in Marfa, Texas, and more recently, How Much House? Thoreau, Le Corbusier, and the Sustainable Cabin. Of course, such a list would be incomplete without a passing comment about his love for classic BMW airhead motorcycles. Such a list of accomplishments would, however, fail to adequately present our guest speaker. So I fabricated a short fiction in the spirit of Calvino in an attempt to convey something ineffable, but nonetheless present. Let me pick up the story near the present day. From the city of Tekne, Upe traveled westward to Telos, which was situated in the middle of the arid expanse. There, the muse of colors met with Upe and spoke to him. In Telos, the vernacular buildings were steadfast and silent, and the dust and the wind coated them with stories from far-off lands. Upe gathered these stories up and wove them together with the soil and the sky and the color, bringing together Tekne and Telos into a singular and rich fabric of azure and red and precious aluminum. And he wrote and dwelled in Telos and was granted the title of Professor of Knowledge. Without further ado, Upe Flueckiger.
Thank you, Mark. Too kind. I want to thank Mark for this beautiful introduction. I want to thank Armando for inviting me, and I want to thank all of you for coming and for spending some time together this evening, especially after the studio day. I can imagine how that feels. So, How Much House? That's the title of the book, but I like to sort of expand how it comes to that. But also, anytime I get asked to be lecturing in places, the interesting thing is it's also a reflection back of how I look at the work itself. So, doing now academic teaching for over 2 decades, I'm spreading some images and words of wisdoms in there, so the students may take it or leave it, like the 7 monuments, the 7 deadly sins, and I invented the 7 pleasures. So they're the 7 words of wisdom, so take it or leave it when you see it. But for me, what the first thing is sort of to let you know when you want to know where you want to go, you have to know where you come from. So what's maybe not visible here so much over here is actually a house embedded in the landscape in which I grew up. So I really didn't have any distinctive idea what I'm going to do, except I love to draw. So this drawing is done at the age of 17. Now you can do your math. But basically the problem for me was I couldn't abstract, so I drew every grass I could see. So the landscape in itself was really part of my upgrowing. And drawing is also what I think is important. And it still will be important whether it is analog or digital. So to me, drawing is equal thinking. So this is the first sort of what I would like to give the students with. In the end, the architects don't build the building, they make drawings of buildings, whether analog or digital, it doesn't really matter. So here are some of my drawings, which I basically still carry with me. I'm just looking at the sketchbook. Because when I draw, I feel like I can actually absorb it. What I draw is 100% conditionally honest on the moment of what I understand. Sometimes I look back and hopefully I still think I can improve and understand more. Together comes the travel. This is the windshield of a 1976 Volkswagen van. It's actually, I did it standing still and then, so I don't think I was driving at the same time. But also what's interestingly to an architect is kind of like, okay, well, you know, a plan, elevation and sections. So here are the sections. And you know, I just looked at when putting the lecture together, I do this crossing wind and it almost looks like, you know, I have the silhouette of the cabin in a small space. So it's in a strange way, you're not sure where your ideas come from, or afterwards you're wondering if they were always planted as a seed in you. The engine on a Volkswagen is in the back. From this drawing right now, I can tell I completely don't understand anything how a flat four works. I know a little bit more now because I work on engines in my spare time, but this is completely wrong, whatever you see. So drawing in the sense of this is Johnson Wax factory, so I basically took a cross-country trip in Racine, Wisconsin, and at every architectural monument I stopped. So modern monument because I was tired of the old monuments. So I have not had an idea that basically this became history. So photography to the right, sketch to the left. It happens at the same time. I felt the light condition could be better studied often or quicker when you actually do take a photography. Proportions, so trip took me from United States to Japan, and then from Japan basically looking at the relationship of the size of Switzerland, and Switzerland is still too big. Just to give you an idea, the state of Texas is about 15 times larger than Switzerland. So, traveling as architecture students, I really think that's a fundamental part of your education. I think when I visit some of the monuments in the past, I have to go revisit. I know there is much more people or many more people there, but I do think architecture fundamentally is a three-dimensional experience, and you can't do it unless you go to the place. So the sort of first thing which placed me on the South Plains, High Plains, further southmost on the High Plains, on the southernmost tip is Lubbock, Texas, where I basically traveled for the first time from New York City, and I can't imagine any starker contrast. And you come from Manhattan, I lived on 64th Street, and you land on Preston Smith International Airport. So what I'd like to show you is, like, I did realize that I immediately loved the climate, and I always studied houses who were economical. So I looked at Charles and Reims, I looked at Eichler homes, and specifically Ralph Robson. Ralph Robson's Greenbelt house, which never got built, but it sort of encompasses a positive spirit, which I think nowadays actually longing a little bit for with all the politics going on. But we start thinking about in 1945, the war just ended, and he's probably a GI who parks his Willys Jeep here and then takes the helicopter off to work. I mean, that was the vision. And Greenbelt house, you know, Robson coming from Minnesota, where it's always cold, but so basically like the entire green part walks through the house, so the landscape is incorporated in it. I thought that was sheer less optimism. We still don't fly to work, but drones have arrived. So I looked at construction methodologies, Eichler homes specifically. I felt like in a place like Lubbock, a person like me with my income could actually design and build his house. Not leaving out the classics completely, here is the number 4 if you look in Emo, in the Villa Emo by Palladio. It's multiple times, 12, 12, 24. Then of course you have the odd, like 27, you have 16, again divided by 4. The house is based basically on a grid which is divided by 4, or by 8, or by 12, because the construction of the plywood sheet, which is 4 by 8, or also the cladding sheet, which allows us to actually make it economical. In Lubbock, you really don't have so much a house prototype besides dugout having no drainage system, or besides surface draining, a dugout didn't seem the right thing. In New Mexico, Stephen Holdick, the courtyard houses studies, so basically designed a courtyard house and with the history of New Mexico in mind, but also Donald Judd, which I knew from Switzerland before actually arriving in Lubbock. By the way, Donald Judd's sister lived in Lubbock, and he mentions it in his book Architecture, and he suggests that she puts a courtyard house in Lubbock. So I thought that was an interesting suggestion. So here it is, Llano Estacado, or Staked Plains. It's one of the flattest area in the world. I describe it as 80% sky and 20% ground, and the only time you really can experience the land is from above, because that's just what you saw in the previous slide. However, Lubbock has an unusual amount of buildings who have cotton. They're designed for cotton storage and ginning, and what they're designed with is something called the angle of repose of cotton. They showed me the campus, said, yeah, Spanish Renaissance, and said, well, that doesn't really do it for me so much, but I truly love the industrial nature of this building and the unusual amount of corrugated iron. I call this the Villa Savoie of Lubbock. You have the raised ground, it's a bit more pragmatic, and then you roll your cotton wagon underneath, and you actually can make your experiment, but basically a similar principle. So on my flight back, I wasn't sure if I got the job. I sketched a house, literally, which was 3 stories tall. And best explained in a section, because I noticed that the stars are really beautiful, and then I would have star viewing parties in the evening, and then there would be the guests, and then on the first floor, you project a movie across the swimming pool. So basically the house was a gigantic stair. So in the morning I would walk down the stair and basically go straight in the pool and swim. So then I got married and a little bit less ambitious. I found love in Lubbock, which is really almost like a song. So it's actually us on the honeymoon. So I said, well, I can't do 3 stories, but maybe I have the money for 2. And rammed earth wall to the west, a little bit tapered to the top. So basically we have traveling the heat, traveling not inside the house and opening it to the east. Several models happened here. So drawing and modeling is still a big part of it. So simply this, I used actually at the time something called landscape, but here it was before iPhone. So you simply put a camera in there and took the picture, because it basically felt like it still gives the best sort of feeling for space and what that space might be. So didn't have the money for the rammed earth. How about brick and then steel to the other side? And it turned out they didn't have the money for that either. So literally we're designing for 3 years, and then after the 3rd year it came to this, and I had to go to 1 story and traditional platform framing. So when people at the time said like flat back from Blue Dot, they said, well, we do a construction for $180 and $190 in 2004. Well, this way is like when it's really sort of competitive to the rest of the new houses in Lubbock, it was exactly $51 per square foot. However, we did build passive heating and cooling systems in there, in the sense that we had 2x6 instead of 2x4s, and the roof is 2x12. So insulation is filled out, and in the summer of 2006 it was featured here. So basically we built it around a couple pecan trees, so the courtyard is really the heart of the house. I'm sorry that color isn't quite right, it should be white on the whole way there. My wife has the studio, she's the artist in the front, I have my studio in the back. Furniture or prototypical furniture basically come out of the same need at the time as Donald Judd. He didn't like the furniture he could buy in Marfa, and I didn't like the furniture available to me in Lubbock, so designed my own. So when you're an architect and you're living in your own house, it sort of has these moments like, okay, what could you do better? Well, first of all, most of the people don't give credit to everybody working on the house. So we didn't build anything on it. As much as I built or designed prototypical furniture, I was an assistant professor then. I was busy trying to get tenure. And the first thing my dean at the time said, don't design. It will take too long. You will not get published with your work. But anyway, what is really important is without the people, you need a good contractor, you need a good client, which is my wife, put up with me, but also the designer there. And then you need the students or whoever is helping you with the design. So Steven Still and Matt Garcia now has a practice in Austin. It's quite successful in single family housing. They weren't doing this for credit, they were doing this for money. So here is my wife. It's just a recent work from last week. She's an integrated part of the house. And she basically called it a Swiss Army knife. I explained it a little bit. But the floor plan, this portion actually is only 1,780 square feet. So then when you add my studio, then it puts it to 2,300 with the garage, which is the taxable amount. And then the garage in itself, which is climate controlled. That's where my wife's studio is. She does cyanotype and uses water. So then it sort of puts it to a range of 2,800. So she basically said it's a Swiss Army knife right here. So this is the ski. I'm working in the can opener and she works in the screwdriver. So the story of that, and actually when a house becomes a home, you sort of feel like the house is really something which then never ends for an architect. Your worst moments are then, right? I mean, you built those tree rounds, and this is a desert willow to the front, but you're sort of hoping, right, it's not going to break on my house. In the back, there is an addition, 190 square feet for my two-wheeled passion. So what I would do different today? So what I learned from the project is basically in housing, the housing I approached, there is really not enough profit for an architect. So if you go by the AI standard, I couldn't pay myself for the 3 years I studied that, but since for me practice is also an investigative thing, it's an important part to do. Cost savings happened exactly where the materials is. So if I wanted to have the two-story building and the rammed earth wall, it's just too much labor intensive. If people drill through the stud wall and the electrical work, I mean, there is just an enormous amount of different planning required if you go with a heavy material, which brought back the notion of Buckminster Fuller, who basically said, well, how much does a building weigh? So on studying, so for you students in here, I really think, like as academics sometimes say, well, I want to wait for the perfect moment to write my book. It will be spring, the semester is just over, it's May the 25th, I have no longer love to do teaching, it's going to be 68 degrees, I have nothing to do all summer except write a book. That thing is not going to happen. So what I'm saying is like in everywhere of today's age, you sort of have to really seize your moment and push along, even with the consequences that it might be not perfect. But at past midpoint of my career, basically see, well, there is the glass half empty, in terms of life expectations and all that. And you sort of glad for the things you did, and then you also live up sort of to the scars you earned. So Donald Judd being sort of in my life before I even arrived in Texas. I'm not sure if Mark remembers this, but my graduation gift to myself was going to Marfa, yes. Texas. Yes. So I didn't bought myself anything else, and I bought before I graduated. So Donald Judd actually somehow struck a chord with me with his work. He basically argued this golden section is too complicated, you should have simple ratio, a square is too square. You do the proportions, take it from Alberti, and basically what you have here is that's the proportion of the book, my first book. In 1968, Donald Judd bought Spring Street 101 for $68,000. It has 2 basements and 5 stories. In 2017, I measured the building, and basically, and these are the drawings now. So, sorry about the yellow, I don't do that, it's the projector. But what we now do is, this is the first edition. After over a decade, it's probably within a year will be a second expanded edition out, and actually have 2 ranches in, and I will talk in the afterword about the urban space of 101 Spring Street. But what really struck me when I went to Marfa first, so here you can sort of see another size thing. So if you go across the continental United States, if you make it all the way from east to west Texas, you're crossing 1/3 size. I mean, I always try to wrap my head around the proportion of that. So this is one of my first drawings in Marfa, 1996. It was a very different place. And a very basic thing, I didn't realize that at the time, is but I was looking for drawings. Were there any drawings from Judd? And then I looked at the drawings, and there were, but they were either very conceptual sketches, which he did, or then they were drawing, which assistants did for him. They were raw. And I said, well, you know, like Donald Judd said, you should never move a piece of work in his installations. Oh, why not just make a drawing instead of comment it? Because since 1962, every of his works he entitled untitled, meaning he doesn't want to project a meaning into the work. And I simply said, well, what about if I produce the drawings and I place the artwork exactly where it is, and I let for everybody see the proportions, and that's the thesis of the book. So here are my students. This is actually here. This is, I think he was here too. This is Jesus Robles. He's partner of Dust. Kate and Jesus, they're both my thesis students. And what they basically did, they measured the drawings, and we made those drawings, and then had first-hand research of that. And that was in 2003, and in 2007 we had the book out. So this is sort of hard to believe, but when we now look at these plans, there was no Google Earth available, and the site plan we did first of the city of Marfa, it was actually all by a satellite photograph which we scanned, and these are the buildings which Donald Judd basically, or the Judd Foundation or Chinati Foundation now owns. About in 1940, they had over 4,000 people living in Marfa. Now it's less than 2,000. When I completed the book, it was over 2,300. What does that do to a community? Well, tax-paying things. Even though there are way more visitors in Marfa, the actual population shrunk. And I'm worried about the school district and all these other things community people need. The prices skyrocketed. There's a new hotel called St. George, which is on the place of the old St. George. And it's, from my taste, a little bit overwhelming. But this is what it looks still today. If you have a chance to go there, go to the courthouse, go on top of it and look down. So here is Donald Judd, age 45. He just purchased what's called the block. My book is actually the first who publishes that photograph. And it's kind of amazing. I just realized it in preparation of the lecture. He had exactly 20 years to accomplish from that very moment he purchased. This photograph is taken. And if you go there, and you actually need to have multiple days to see the work, to pay the attention of it. I'm very impressed with the vision he carried on for those 20 years. So you can see this is sort of dilapidated here. You can see the adobe exposed, weed. It's probably February. That's what Lubbock looks, and also Marfa, it's just brown. In San Antonio, you really can't imagine that. I mean, for the last 2 weeks, it actually rained in Lubbock, so Lubbock looks actually almost as green as the hill country right now. So here we did the drawings. It was over 100 drawings. We published over 200 drawings. We published probably about 120. And this is his kitchen. And here is sort of what I think most architects get wrong about Donald Judd. And I still think I didn't make a good enough point in my first book. I hope to actually sort of drive this home in the expanded edition, but note these shelves, everything. This is actually not a glass ceramic stove. This is a regular stove you buy. There is no closed cabinet. Everything is open shelf. But there are architects like John Pawson, you know, like you light from upside down, you know, like you should never light from upside down anything, you know, if you really want to experience a space and don't get blinded, you shouldn't do that. There is a sink, so you know when it is, you never know when the water comes, right, the airport sink, that sort of thing. And I'm not trying to make it fun, I really actually think the minimalism is appropriate, but it's not what Donald Judd was talking about. Zumthor also refers to Judd, his sculpture, not his architecture, and then basically makes his own work, but it is not the technological part of Zumthor. So Judd's idea of sort of the raw spaces and actually do with what's given, especially in the remoteness of Marfa, is I think what's not understood enough. So what it will have, my next book also will have an additional chapter on something called the ranches. Donald Judd owned 3 ranches at the time of his passing, over 40,000 acres of ranch land with it. Very few people know that he actually started out, the first one he owned in 1976, and that's the ranch I'm going to show you. So 3 years after he arrived, he actually bought the ranch, probably about 45, 50 miles south of Marfa. Takes a 4-wheel vehicle to go there. You had something called Pinto Canyon Road, and if you see here, that's where you're going to go. So you have to imagine, the moment you drop off, you're on the mesa of Marfa, and then you drop off to something called what's Pinto Canyon. And when you're in that, there is literally no cell phone reception anymore. They get about 6 to 7 inches less rain than in Marfa, and it's 10 degrees warmer than it is at any time in Marfa. So you couldn't have cattle out there. What you would actually have is goats and sheep. And together with Pedro Espinet, we actually measured this in 1 day. So this is Casa Morales. He named it after the first rancher, or the rancher who owned it before, which I thought was kind of neat. You know, he wouldn't say all of a sudden he came to architecture untitled. So he gave it the owner of the previous, who was previously there. This is really important for me to point out, and I think it applies also to San Antonio, but an architect in Texas needs to know how to create shade. Just needs to know that. Judd understood that with his pergolas. You can see that it is not just any type of porch, you know, he's extending that. Why? I have no idea. And then this interesting part, we did the plan here, so it has this surrounding here with the sort of 3-foot tall wall. And then in the back for the bathroom, often you have to go to a different place. Okay, let me show you this first. So here the simple move is that he simply exposed the wood part and the roof structure of the rock house. It's built in rocks. And then this is what I wanted to point out over here is actually that shading porch where your sink is. So your bathroom is outside, so you're washing here and you go and see the, basically go up in the morning, wash yourself and look at the landscape and be part of it. So what would I do different? Well, I never met Donald Judd, but doing a book is kind of not how it started out. But a book basically is sort of the end result, but I talked to people who met Judd, and I talked to a foreman, and I wish I would have an original recording from the time. I wish I would have dated everything. I'm pretty good at dating things, but I didn't. So all of a sudden there is all kinds of this information, and Marfa is 5 hours, driving hours away from Lubbock, and all of a sudden you realize you can't go back there, or somebody who wanted to give me a photograph passed away. And I have the memory of the verbal agreement, and I can't do anything about it. So this is an important part. I think this is what I will carry with me. What I also learned from Judd is really that when it comes to spatial arrangements, he's never wrong. I mean, I'm saying this is a big word, but in architecture, space is everything. I mean, if you get the arrangement of space, if you get your spatial planning right, you're really halfway there. And as I need to go 1 second back, I think when you're in first year, second year, you may be very good at laying out things, you may be very good at graphics, or you may be good at movies or something, but you don't know that yet. So when you're a second and third year student, because only you can actually figure that out. But to imagining three-dimensional spaces is a very different thing than doing two-dimensional two-dimensional adjustments and graphics. It's valuable, it's what architects do also, but you need to know that. So now we're shifting a little bit to Lubbock work, where I would say also Judd is sort of looking over my shoulder all the time. It's a fairly raw space here. Obviously the artist who worked in 2D very much. I don't know why the editor, but the editor put it on the cover of Texas Architect. So we have a few adaptive reuse building here. This is the former police garage, which now is basically once a month on first Friday, the driving hub of the city. The life where sort of Lubbock literally comes together. Started out with 37 people on the first art trail. Now we're clocking about between 3,000 and more visitors on a Friday. So the canopy, instead of getting rid of the canopy because the pumps were filled with sand, the pumps were taken away, tanks were filled with sand. But I have the canopy there. I would not remove it because we do need shade in West Texas, and simply uplighted it. So this is the gallerist. This is the person who gave me the commission. This is before. This is a painting studio for a car painter, and to the right there is the storage place for the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. That's our newspaper in Lubbock. You know, the flattest part of the world has a newspaper called the Avalanche Journal. So this is before, this is after. So this is adaptive reuse, and well, I have to say this is like we really put some life in there. So the in-between space, so if you go anything on Judd's work, always has to do with in-between space, basically made that the private courtyard of the gallery person. So what's there before, sort of a pass-through, that's already under construction, basically becomes the private courtyard of the owner of the gallery, who basically has his own gallery, but then also runs 4 artist studios. So this is sort of a scary moment. That's the entrance of the main gallery. The building isn't very good in terms of its foundation, because it simply was started out as a hardware store at the time. It leaked, but they basically said, well, we expose all the trusses. I took a picture from the trusses, sandblasted everything, and then made mobile panels for the layout of the gallery, and of course put HVAC system in there. This is his residence. This is Charles right here. There his look. I mean, you can't really see it, but I just envision him like, God, what did I build here? And then you see the Lubbock Avalanche Journal vending machines. You know, this is really a thing of the part. You can't find a newspaper vending machine anymore. So they stored these things. So this is after we did it. So basically rearranged the bedrooms for him, did a paint coat, and brought his old furniture in there, which prompts me to say something about furniture in general. You know, architects sometimes have this obsession. No, I have to have modern furniture in there. You know, it's like I'm a modern designer and all that. And I feel like if it's designed well, if your proportions are right, you can take any type of furniture. And I'm glad Charles has his antique furniture in here. The studio project, that's the one new public building I did. I did that with Joe McKay Architects. That would be a little bit too big for me on my own. It did win the highest AIA award that year. What it basically is a context of the art district, or now became the art district, and that's the Louise Hopkins Underwood Center to the left. And here is the place where we're actually going to build. So the idea is to actually create the space for 4 artists who live there, say, about a half year, sometimes a year, and then they open up their studios for every first Friday evening. They have a private area where they live, and they have an area where they pay, when they started out 10 years, about a rent of $400, which is economical. In terms of the light, I quickly show that section here is very important. It's not a skylight, it's a clear story light. Skylights actually in West Texas, ecologically speaking, don't work very well. But we give the light in of the east and west, north and south. So every single unit actually is lit the exact same way. So here we sort of show you the zoning, and that's the private courtyard, that's the living space, that's the wet cell, and then the passage, transition through work, and then the studio, and the sixth, perhaps what the space and the most successful space I ever designed. This is now sort of a real popular area in terms of where the community meets. I'll show you the slide at the end. Things went not that well, you know, you look, I really have an affinity for funds. So this we gave out to the person with the fund, and this is what it turned out to be. So don't just focus on it, but it's nothing but what it should be. So I get a little bit later into it, but these are the conceptual sketches to it. So the container right there is a freight train going through, so there is a relationship to that, but there is also the relationship to art. What does all the artists do with the art they don't sell? I said, well, you know, they can put it up there in storage. We obviously didn't put a ladder in there, otherwise we had to go and do everything ADA up there too. So it's just a suggestion, and basically we used it as signage and as a carport, so to give shade for the vehicle, but also protection from hail, which we have in West Texas. So these are the private entrances, and these sliding gates roll over, and that gives you an impression of the private space. To the south, so there's a little garden. And then there also the sort of edge construction, which really in Lubbock doesn't happen. You always go first the parking lot, and then you see the building. And that's what you see with Charles's Gallery down there. This is why we kept the building, because we didn't want to have the new setbacks dealing with those, which would have sort of ruined the whole idea. And this one is Linda Cohn, the artist at the time. She's long moved out. Different artist is in there. And then basically this is when they get ready for First Friday. And that communal area, first sketched out here and then in realization, that's really where the life now happens on every First Friday. And it sort of connects to the city. What did I learn? Well, I learned this: adaptive reuse is always more expensive than new. This is why you don't do adaptive reuse in this country, because often the substance of the building is actually not that good. But if we would have not taken those old buildings to make Charles's Gallery, we wouldn't have much room left, because we would have to adapt to the new zoning and setbacks. Now, come on. In West Texas especially, where it is hot, I'm sure here it is similar, but never underestimate how much space HVAC systems take. I thought this tiny little thing there, and they would have some sort of great space above and all that. No, they came with stuff in there. So, okay. Signage, lettering, I asked for Helvetica, I got something. So. It was also the time when we went and slid into the Great Recession. So seeing the contracts change, scramble, bidding was really, really something. And I don't think that's really so much on our management part, but the idea that we actually went through that moment, and the competitive bidding, and maybe too competitive. So I think you sort of have to give and take in terms of, you have to make sure your contractors can make a profit also. So 5, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I always say I'm not inventing anything, everything is to reinvent. Basically, every time I look at history, it's already there in a way, and I think we cannot underestimate that. I get to the ecological part now. So this is actually sort of what we consider now a dated book. But it's 2004, I believe, massive change. But this comes out of that book. It's actually on the first page when you open the cover. You know, it sort of hit me when that came. For most of us, design is invisible until it fails, right? Until the light goes out and I can no longer present, I will have to offer you something with no more visuals. How many of you remember Hurricane Floyd? Probably not many, but we basically still are not prepared for that. That's 1999. 1 year I arrived in Lubbock. So there, yeah, that's exactly 20 years ago. So what you see basically, this is now a daily conversation, you know, that we sort of look helpless with this situation. I would say that's why I'm saying is like, okay, in any of my works, I try to give credit to everybody who is involved. I really think the individual, the sort of heroic architect, especially like what Corbusier likes to appear, or Frank Gehry is another one, I don't really believe in that sort of notion. So, here is the history of fossil fuel in 10 seconds. Well, maybe less. So where that yellow dot is, that's basically the fossil fuel age. So before there we heated somehow, and after that hopefully we will also. It probably took hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years to actually create the oil we take out of our earth. But there will be an after us. So in a sort of big picture view, the idea of having an ecological architecture, it just should be. You shouldn't be specialized in ecological architecture. The Romans invented some heating systems, obviously only the privileged ones, and we will have a heating system with renewable sources. But in that dot, literally we're going to burn up about the fossil fuel, which took millions of years to actually have. So the history comes once more back when we actually look a little bit on the education of the architect, that the climate and the site in itself, it truly matters. Architects always looked at that. And we just happened to get out of this, especially before the first oil crisis, 1972. We didn't care how much oil we burned because it was so cheap. I have to say, I remember in 2000 I got gas 1 gallon below $1 in Lubbock, Texas. Anytime I drove around Switzerland, who by the way has the cheapest gas anywhere in Europe, it costs 3 times more. Now think about you're going outside and you go home, probably came by car, and you pay 3 times as much. I'm going to tell you, you're going to change your behavior instantly. And it's not because it costs more shipping there, it's a simple tax question. So solar power, we kind of all know that, but it comes also of Bruce's book. Solar power basically has it. It creates the wind, it creates any energy we actually use. And when we look at that every 2.5 minutes, it would serve that. That's pretty impressive. So that last project basically tried to combine these things: ecological architecture, design build, community design, and interdisciplinary collaboration. So Thoreau is kind of a tricky person because he already is sort of the godfather of ecology, and you can't really talk about it anymore because everybody mentions it. But the idea that somebody wrote down the cost and said, well, $28.12.5, which is roughly $700 in today's money, and you can maybe get the cheapest tool shed at Home Depot for that type of money. But what's interesting is his sister actually did that drawing of his house. He never referred to it as a cabin. And here is where ours landed a few years after we finished it. But fast sort of back more than 10 years ago, this is what we started with. When I saw that thing coming, I really thought, gosh, what are we going to do here? So we started out from a double wide. It was 53 feet long. We basically cut it in to 24 and extended it to 28 and 14, sorry about that. I rented a warehouse And my class, by the way, not a studio, but a product design class, came out there and the students worked on this twice a week. So here you have 2 years, which is the time it took to build. This is also, I don't have an Instagram or Facebook, so we basically just had a screen capture up there taking the pictures of it. But it sort of also was something I did in graduate school, which Mark remembers. I did prefabricated housing. So this idea of actually prefabricate something and put it out there was an ideal tool. A product design class is a little bit different from a studio. I always have this problem when you do a design studio, well, you know, and design build, well, how are you actually going to do this in the end? Everybody cannot design that, so you always make compromises. And I know that Dan Rockhill talked here a while ago, and I actually visited Dan Rockhill in Kansas, and I just always felt like everything looks like Dan's architecture. And I felt like, well, we try to have a different approach here. So this is in the end out on the site. The funding was done, basically applied for grants and donations, and then basically hold it out. We brought students to the site multiple times, so they did some patio adjustments. We'll go about this a little bit. And then some testing. Here you see the various seasons. We took infrared cameras out, measured where the heat is escaping, put the heating up, and basically finished that within 2 years. It's too long. So for a laboratory, it's about 140 miles away from Lubbock, Texas. It's a complete failure for that. You can't go out in an afternoon and show it and come back. I wish you would have been closer. I'm going to show you that. It's just impossible because you burn the whole day when you do that. Ecological design is always more expensive. I mean, no matter how you slice it. So when you go to the material itself a little bit, we actually used for the insulation cotton. We used recycled denim cottons. I don't wear jeans today. So that thing didn't work. Never underestimate the small volume. What I'm trying to say is that obviously it heats very quickly, but when you have a house for about 2,000, 2,300 square feet, what you're noticing when you have different rooms and different orientations, certain rooms stay cooler. This actually, even though the insulation sort of delays it for a long time, but it's heating up a small volume rather quickly. So, I'm getting to the more practical things I'm trying to get to you today. On tectonics and technology, to understand the nature and qualities of materials is essential. It really, really is, I believe, today because of that. This is why we still do hands haptic ons, because that's the only time students really get to experience that, what it means to put up a wall. I have to tell you that the one wall we took down 3 times just to make it straight enough, and it's actually still crooked. So, because practice does that, and then as architects, you're not going to actually build. Yes, you maybe become a design builder, but architects, most of the time, they want to draw the buildings and not make the buildings themselves, but you're gaining experience by building the cabin, how it actually is, if you're asking a contractor, a craftsman, to do so. I was a bit surprised, so Birkhäuser published, proposed 3 languages. And then most recently, actually this fall, the Spanish language came out by Gustavo Gili, which is a publisher out of Spain, Barcelona, Spain. So here is sort of the things which I felt would have been a great page. I imagine this would be in color and it would be a triple fold out. And here is what I end up, like 1 page with 3 panoramas, but I'm going to show it to you in a different way. Because here is the understanding of Thoreau's time. Okay, this is a 360-degree view. And, oops, sorry. Where you actually see the donut, that's where Thoreau's cabin is. So what the understanding was, Thoreau clearly knew that you can't really dominate or control nature. But it was just shifting because it's the beginning of the industrial age. And right now we're going into another beginning of, not beginning anymore, but the digital age and the robotization. And people are kind of a similar way afraid of their jobs. but his understanding of nature was still in the sense that we are not going to control it, because at his time, what was actually just introduced is that just the balloon frame was invented, but he chose to build it in a traditional post and beam. Le Corbusier's cabin, the nature is as important as the cabin itself, and then ours on the high plains. So I'm asking the question of size in the essay before, and I noticed that the average house in 1948, 54, something like that, was about 1,400 square feet. Today is almost twice as much or more, the average size of the house. So obviously that takes a lot of more energy, that takes a lot of more resources to produce, and the question is whether it is used. Here we actually can see that Thoreau never referred to his house as a cabin. He always called it a house. It's post and beam, very solid. That's the site and the earliest photograph. There is no known photograph of the house. The only thing I actually did identify, I went to the Thoreau Institute, and this supposedly is an original beam of the house. They moved it back into town and actually used it for grain storage for some time. And you know, he did not actually purchase the axe, he borrowed an axe, and his famous saying is he gave it back sharper than when he took it. So to sort of see these marks was special, I have to admit that. So that's actually when you see a hewn beam. And he actually squatted the wood, which is the lumber, of course, he didn't pay it for, so he cheated in his bill a little bit there, because that was Emerson's land. This is the brick proportions, and then there is the, not the industrialized nail, but the hand-forged nail. This is called Thoreau's Cove, and then that's the original site. So the interesting thing is, if you have been there, you actually see a reproduction of the cabin in the parking lot. You know, it doesn't look anything on the site. So what we did here is I took photographs and the site of the Thoreau, and I ran as fast as I could to the site and superimposed it, so the light condition is actually the exact same thing, but you can't experience that. But to me, the site and the idea of the space is very important. You know, your context, your landscape. I had a chance, because of a conference I went to go in the fall, and if you know Walden, it goes you through actually all 4 seasons. I wish I would have spring and summer too. So here are the coordinates, so I made sure I had brought that with me. And here's the one thing, again, what happened with the drawing. I need to speed up here, but here is where Thoreau did over 200 surveys. He actually made money off that. And if you actually see how an excellent draftsman he is, and where the donut is, it says house. And then here you can read it now, but you also see this. You see here, right, actually he puts the footprint down of his house. Okay? So since I have all the money of the world, I go to the original edition and buy it. No, I did not. Starts around $10,000 if you want a first edition of Thoreau's Walden. But what I notice is the plan is in there, his drawing is in there, and if you notice here, it has that mark there which is indicating the house. That's the page where it is. And then what happens in the annotated edition, Jeffrey S. Kramer is an expert on Thoreau. He does every annotation into the original one, but when you start looking at the house, it's not there. Now, obviously, because this is how you can see how architects are seen by the other part of non-architects in society. Well, there may be some. That was a smudge there, it doesn't belong, and over the years it got lost. I have about 10 copies, different editions of Walden. In none I could find that mark, which is indicating the orientation of the house. So basically that's important to me, but I don't understand why basically things like that get lost. Again, the materiality, I could go into that, but we went to the original archives. This was prefabricated, so we studied prefabrication. The site is absolutely spectacular. I mean, here is Monaco. If you go to Monaco here, that's where literally the $1 million yachts are. Need to make that. Right here. And there is the least, the fewest non-employed people in the world, the smallest nation. You know, they have fewer, they probably have zero. You know, Switzerland has few. But underneath there is actually the public beach you see, and to go to Le Corbusier's cabin, you have to go through this. So this is such about down to 4 feet wide. You can't drive a vehicle there. You maybe squeeze a scooter in there, and then the train track is above here, and that's the roof right there. So I think thanks to this sort of remoteness, even though it's in one of the most expensive areas, right, with Monaco in the world, it actually, because of that, was protected. So a section always helps. So again, drawings comes in. So here you actually have the railroad track here. So I learned actually they took it apart, they brought it at 4 o'clock in the morning, between 3 and 4, and then brought it on the train track and carried it down to the site and assembled it. Okay, I need to do a show, sorry. So here is the other thing I observed. I show you this one. So everybody talks about the square, and Corbusier famously says it's 3.66 by 3.66 meters, square meters. No, it's not. It has a corridor and a bathroom and an access to the restaurant, but it doesn't talk about the yellow part, ever. And it's not a square, and I think I'm basically the first one pointing that out in this particular case. So he's misleading in that, but I also think it's really important to show these aspects which then are not there, because this his cabin doesn't have a kitchen. What you do basically is you go in there to the restaurant and he could get his meals. Same spot. This is his small studio, and this is actually where you had to walk. So known photographer, this is him leaving. And then last but not least, we already talked a little bit, but I want to say a few things about the concept of ours. It didn't start it out, it started in 2006. And it started actually close to Lubbock, where you go and access it. But at the time, nobody said, well, we can give you land or borrow land or anything like that. After it got some notoriety, of course, they said, well, why didn't you brought the cabin here? I said, well, so this is always difficult how you make a pitch, because architecture is so expensive. In the sense it's like, you know, you can only convince people really from the idea when it's built, and that's again the same situation that when you have to build it is actually expensive, but you also have to sort of make that pitch to convince that to do it by drawings. These were for fundraising purposes, for grants, so basically it's touching lightly the ground and heating, cooling, and here are the ghosts of Thoreau, all the testing part, students do all that, and then the building in itself. So passive heating, cooling situations there, simple things like that. So the building is shading itself in the evening, so there is a space to sit. And the finished product. Water recycling. And West Texas is perhaps one of the harshest climates I ever built. Also, the other recommendation is never build anywhere unless you live there for a year. So the eyesight from outside and inside, sort of the metal is the tough response to the outside, and then the warmth comes from the wood on the inside. So the bulk fish, it would be more economical. The panoramas, I explained it. I could show it in the lecture. I'd like to have them actually in color, fold-out pages. And other than that, still too close to church. So when it comes to ecology, Thoreau sort of said it best. And I think you can hear that discourse every day in the news. Here, you can't read everybody, but I made sure everybody is on here who ever worked on this sustainable cabin or gave a donation or anything about it. It really cannot underline enough how important that is. So the last recommendation on life, You just always, especially now, a sense of humor in this day and age. And as I said, I promised I would show also my love of biking. And I show it to you because it's like, you know, life is an adventure, but the interesting thing is the scary part on the motorcycle is when you take off. Once you go actually fast, it becomes more stable. It's kinetics, it's inertia. So what I'm trying to show you here is the most stable is actually when you're on the bike and ride. I mean, don't do this. But you can even experience it with a bicycle if you know the motorcycle. You know, you wobble a little bit when you take off. When the inertia takes on, you're actually quite something in there. But that has that carpe diem moment that you really have to go out there and risk something. So of course I have to end with a quote of Piercy. And this is actually literally taken on the fall equinox, which wasn't too long ago, in the last day of September. This was on the 23rd. The landscape, I started with the landscape. It doesn't matter in which part you are, whether it's an urban landscape or a rural landscape, but to me that's a very important part of how I define my work in the world. Thank you. So if you have any questions, I know I had to speed up towards the end a little bit. I entertain any questions you might have. Comments, jokes?
You had a slide with Tolstoy on it.
Yes.
You didn't say anything about it.
Yes, it has to do.
On how much land does one man need?
Yes, and it comes out of a short story of Tolstoy, and he says, how much land? And there is like a man, his name Pahom, and what he does is, the Bashkir people in Russia, which I always imagined, my dad read that story to me. When he goes around, he can start at dawn, and he goes around, he can walk around the square, and when he gets back before the sun sets, all that land he can circumvent, that will be his. And of course he did that, and in time it's so close that he had to run at the very end, and when he ran at the very end, he was so exhausted, he died right there on the spot. And then of course his helper buried him right there, and the answer was, well, how much did he need? And you know, the exact size of a grave. So anyway, it's a short story. It's much better when he says it, but I basically paraphrase on that in the ecological part of what I found, whether it is our house with the studio, which is fairly spacious, but if we have a house which is, say, smaller, instead of like 6,000 square feet, and it has every conventional thing in there, but you go, say, with 2,000 or so, you're more economical or ecological than actually making solar panels on your roof, for example, or driving a Prius. Nothing against all these things; these are important. But I'm saying is like often we could actually reduce that. And here I'm asking the question, literally, why we have to have twice as large homes with, say, 1.5 children. Before we had in the 50s, we had 2 or more children, and we had 1,400 square feet. So it's a question about size. Probably too long, nothing. Yes.
Hi, thank you for talking. It was nice. I have a question on the book Massive Change. You talk about the change of behavior. So I guess my question is on the lack of behavior and how, as designers or architects, right? How we design to make a little bit of a, I guess, change or an impact or some kind of way, right? Because I mean, we design things, and for that, I guess if you could like talk a little bit more on that, because it kind of like struck to me that you say something about the gas, right? Like how like it's so cheap here in Texas, and then like if you go somewhere else, like you almost kind of like think about it twice, right? Like I guess like in designing, how did you kind of like challenge the user to make that change?
I think it's, if I would know, then we would have almost resolved the world problems. I mean, the question is really there. What I point my students to is two things. I point them to an article, Why the Brain Isn't Green. That's a New York Times article in the Times Magazine a few years ago. And basically it's arguing, why are we not doing anything? Because we know we're using these resources are finite, and we're gonna basically, if things not change, it will be an unsustainable planet. I don't have the answer to that, but I can tell you it starts with the individual. I mean, you know, like I'm trying not to use plastic, so I brought a glass cup. I mean, this sounds stupid, but that's something I do in all my lectures, whether it is lecturing to my intro class or it is here. But what the thing is really is like there is, I think that will be, it has to get so instantly, because this is a decent space, but you know, I feel like in the College of Architecture in Lubbock, not everything is perfectly designed. And a bad space, you know, it maybe doesn't hurt you, but you're dying every day a little bit. I mean, that's now somebody, you know, like the students are lucky because after 5 years they move on, but I am there. So in a way, I know from, for example, the Johnson Bag factory, we know that the people in that big hall in Racine, Wisconsin are more productive because the space is good, because it affects your health. What I'm trying to say, human nature is such that they basically, it's not hurting me instantly, I still breathe well, I'm not sensitive enough. Or, you know, some people are very sensitive to say that there's formaldehyde in the carpet and all that, they can't stand it. They get hives or things. So what I'm saying is, like, in the end it will change, but it takes a person like Greta Thunberg who basically now says, you know, you're ruining our future. I mean, she's 16 years old, and I'm not sure if she's a Jeanne d'Arc type of person, but I do think the younger generation will be unforgiving for some certain things we do right now. But the human behavior that we're not changing, well, why not everybody hiring an architect? Because we can already do better solutions. But, you know, with the house, I sort of, if I wouldn't want to do it for my own exercise, I can live off designing houses like that. It was published in the New York Times. I get phone calls from the entire nation, and they wanted to buy my plans. They said, I can't sell you my plans, you know, you live in upstate New York, there will be a different climate and all that. I couldn't do it, but they didn't have the respect, sort of saying, well, hiring an architect, that's what I recommended from there, and would help on these things because it also costs money. So going back to the gasoline prices, this is simply taxing. So the Swiss tax the gas the least in Europe, so that's why it's more expensive in Germany. But what happens is then basically like you're changing your behavior, so economics will change your behavior in that regard. But that's then getting into politics, you know. What I learned so far is like what I try to do is I can't change politics so much, I try to do good architecture where I can. So that's not a very, well, it's really not an answer, is it?
Great.
Well, I remember some years ago a lamp that one of your students designed.
Yes.
With jute and twine, and this gets to your question. I think it was a $5 limit, a budget.
Yes, you had a budget, yes.
A budget for a lamp. And I believe this lamp, and as you wrap these 4 threaded rods, it was maybe 17, 18 inches tall, maybe a little less. As you wrap them, they start to curve inward, right? Mm-hmm. They start to curve because of the moment. The moment arm gets greater, and they come in further, which is actually hard to do. It's hard to wrap that perfectly. But I was thinking to myself, you know, that's a beautiful, beautiful lamp, and it was $5, right? And you know, we can do that ourselves. We can go and we can buy the block of wood, buy the threaded rods, get the socket, the bulb, wrap it with the jute, and we don't. We buy surfaces, we buy images, we buy signs. We're forever obsessed with these things which have none of the values that you're talking about, which have to do with material, landscape, space, light, you know, good form.
Yeah, but see, you're helping me as usual. You know, he and I shared an office in 1994 at Virginia Tech.
He survived too, and that was really quite amazing.
Life works in mysterious ways.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is absolutely right. Is like, I think most architects don't want to deal, when you saw the first house, my wife is so instrumental in this. She says, well, when we went to from the 2-story building, I said, I give up. We don't have the money, you know, like after 3 years of planning, I literally changed it in 2 weeks to a 1-story building. But there, what it is like you're changing it with materials you basically don't want, because I was over 40 years of age, but I felt crushed. All of a sudden I couldn't do my whole glass, I had to slash the glass, my 2nd story, my 21 skylights, all that slashed for cost. And then we go down to a 2x4 platform construction. I mean, most architects don't want to have the tectonics of that. But when I saw the construction going on and I understood, it was my wallet. It was my money, but I also saw, like, when they put the wiring in, I will never forget. They came with the drill right there, and it's like, with my rammed earth wall, well, I had a whole channel, it was good on the drawing, but it would have cost me just so much more money. But that willingness to still work in those small margins, I think most architects are not ready to do that. You know, New York Times picked it up, Texas Architect picked it up, it's in a few books, but I think here is the criticism in architecture. Sometimes we overrate novelty. And novelty in the sense that, well, it has to just apply a material we haven't seen. Or when I see Frank Gehry's architecture and I see how he builds the traditional beams, but structurally takes so much more, and then it looks beautiful with the cladding, I get that. But it just tortures myself, and I have to look at the board-tie beams, because they're not onto the construction system of what technology could do. They're old-fashioned, like a pier and beam Corbusier building put together. So I think the 20th century really, really overvalued innovation, the novelty. And I think many of these houses who were actually not livable, you know, La Villa Savoye is not livable, or wasn't livable, it leaked, it was cold in the winter, and the client was angry. Now, very few architecture professors talk about that, but I think it's still, I have to say, conceptually still one of the most important buildings, but to have a sort of the willingness to work in the smaller area where maybe less innovation is on material-wise. What did I do? I used corrugated metal. And the only reason that it was unusual is that it is on a residential building and not on an industrial building like in Lubbock. And I actually thought about this for a long time, because the people in Lubbock, they didn't really like it in the sense that they felt it is associating them with work. That's how I analyzed it. And I saw it as a very sturdy material holding up to the elements of West Texas. So. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that by like your 3rd or 4th year of architecture school that you architects realize that whether they're a 2D, 3D,
yes.
or 4D designer. When did you realize that, and what kind of a designer do you?
It took me very long. Well, I went first to apprenticeship, and then I went to art school. And that was the 80s, and everybody in art school did videos. You know, VH tapes, beta tapes, you don't know that, you're way too young. And I was not good at conceptual art, and said, oh, you're too pragmatic, you can draw well, you know. And then I went to the architects, and the architects said, oh, you're too conceptual. So I felt always in between. I really did. And then I worked with an undergraduate degree for over a decade, and I got to the United States. And there I met Mark, and I met a man named in Switzerland first, Olivio Ferrari, and said, well, I don't go there. You maybe teach. I wanted to go to Mexico. And I didn't have a master's degree. You can't teach without a master's degree. But I still was there, and I just felt the drawing part was the most important part for me, but then to create space, I felt I had that always. I felt like, I remember when I was probably 8, and I remember the day, it was morning, and it was a resort out of Switzerland, and I remember making extension line of a big barn, and that being a perspective. So I realized space, to go to your answer. And I think that's what fascinates me on Judd. I mean, when I look at the spatial arrangement, because one thing I failed to say, in Marfa, these buildings are not architecture, but they become architecture the way he arranges skylights and simple moves and positions his artwork. And I think a little bit I did of that in my house. I mean, the spatial arrangement, it's not inventive in forms, it's usually an Euclidean grid. Not because I don't like circles, but because that's the economical part still affecting there. So space was always there, I just couldn't articulate it. And then what I did, it always drew, but I love perspective more than anything. So as an abstraction, then the traveling part. I'm not sure if that answers it. Yes?
Did you look at Heidegger's hut at all?
I did, but I never visited it. And there is another important one. I think Wittgenstein also had one. And there's a man named in Norway who had, it's called Ladan, he had a box. But I haven't approached it from a philosophical Heidegger point of view. But I'm aware of it.
So what books are you reading now?
I just read a story about Pinto Canyon. I actually have it here. It's not a story, it's actually the development of south of Marfa where those dirt ranches are.
Yes.
And it was only discovered for only ranching land literally for 50 years. They couldn't scratch a living out of there. I mean, it's a border book basically, an incredible story. Philosophical books, not right now, on my night table. But that's what I have. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How about cottages as infill and denser housing that still have some of the character or personal space of a cottage, but not be part of sprawl, but actually be a part of an existing city?
Yeah, that's difficult. And I think you're speaking to something like, you know, there is really something very comfortable about living in a neighborhood like I live with a single family house in a small lot. It's actually only 50 feet, the lot I built my house on. But I think it's part of the culture. So for example, in New York, you put up with things, when you live in Manhattan, you put up with things you wouldn't put up otherwise. Because the city is kind of your living room. So I think we're probably moving through a shift there also. I think we'll have to share more in the future. I think currently to have everybody have these large homes, that's not sustainable. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the rural-urban turns out, because, you know, the urban farming, that whole concept of people moving to the cities, and the rural towns, so many I drive through on my way to Marfa, they can't make it. I mean, it's a very, very hard thing to watch. It's just, there is cotton farming, there's just not enough money there. And any town on the 10,000 population-wise, 20 years I drive through with it, project in studios, we can come up with all kinds of things. When the internet first arrived, we thought, well, they want to work remote. It's a problem. So I think, personally, I think there's just not going to be the resources. We will just have less. I do believe that. Think about just thinking like a continent like India or China having the same sizes of everything, using the same amount of water like we do, the same amount of energy. That footprint is not sustainable. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that building ecological is more expensive. What do you think could be some strategies to maybe make it equal with not ecological?
Eventually it will, right? So if everybody drives an electric car, it will not going to cost that much. But I literally look at a Tesla tree right now, and I live in West Texas, right? And it's like, it's also, it's not very practical because 4 people put in there, and I carry a lot of stuff. My wife carries a lot of stuff because she's an artist. But if I want to go to Lubbock, to Marfa, I can't in a Tesla. I maybe make it there. And they said $30,000 and they said 35. Yeah, that's your very base model with the small battery pack. But if you're trying to actually really go distances, it's just not there. So it's also an economical thing. Once there are enough there, it will actually work, but somebody has to pioneer there. And it becomes down to economics. The house, I maybe should have explained a bit more. It has a silver roof. And in West Texas, we get so much sunlight, and the reflection, it really, really helps with your cooling. An enormous amount. And 95% of the roofs in Lubbock are black or dark gray. So simply with that, it doesn't cost you any bit, but people are unwilling to do that. Or relatively few are actually looking at these sort of things. So there is one. And the other one, it was only briefly mentioned, is the passive heating cooling. If I put the window in the right place or the wrong place, that's my decision. It can affect spatially, but also with passive heating and cooling methods. But I just noticed that, the solar energy, and then that's 10 years ago, so the cabin is now 10 years old. I'll have to say, all that equipment is the prices came way down. So, I mean, I think, you can actually have that. So that's no longer when we were there. But I think what I maybe, the cabin is also a sort of a philosophical approach, how you actually look at how much we consume. It's sort of a take home personal. And I know it is hard, it's just hard. Even if I come here, it's like, well, I'm going to get a plastic bottle, even if I don't want to. And everybody has heard about the ocean. I mean, it's so hard to actually do something towards that. Even the decision if I drive or fly, it's like in Europe there is something called like SUV shaming going on because you're driving a large vehicle. So I think these things are shifting, but I think the pioneering always takes more money. And except you do a spatial arrangement which can improve my house. The economical, the heating, cooling bill is usually less than every other house because of where we put the windows and the roof on the first project.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.